Hello, class. Thank you so much for submitting the midterm paper on time. I know it's not easy, especially as you go through the semester and we're getting towards the busy season. I really appreciate your hard work for this course and your active involvement in the class discussion through the discussion forum. Next week, well, actually this week, right? Because I'm recording it in advance. So when you propose the proposal, don't think of it as something that you need to be perfect on. It's a proposal and it's really short length. All I want is you to share your ideas and thoughts on your final paper so that you can get some feedback, constructive feedback from your classmates. If we were in-person class and we were actually sitting in person face to face, we would have, broken into small groups and discussed your proposals within that small group, right? So it's basically the same thing, but it's more of the former way of doing it because it's asynchronous. So just think of it as if you're talking to your classmates, like two or three people, like in front of you sitting, and you're just talking to each other about like, oh, I'm gonna do my paper. I'm gonna explore on this subject on my paper, and the case study will be around about this. Um, the source of the case study is news article, let's say. And what I want to really look into through this paper is this. Just casually talk as if you're casually talking to your classmates and you get feedback, right? So don't really think of it as something that like it's a huge project that you're working on. It's something that just casually you are sharing with your classmates. And this will be a good midpoint check for your final paper. It's an initial step for developing your final paper. And this will be actually very helpful to hear what other peers are thinking, so that you can get some like fresh ideas and you can also get some, critique, not criticizing, but critique of your proposal. So yeah, that's it. And for the final paper, you will combine all we have learned in that paper, including your midterm paper, your case study, and developing your proposal you already have um, by then. And I mean, we will think about this violence and especially sexual violence, domestic violence, violence against undocumented immigrants or asylum seekers this week. We're going to engage the four types of Christian stance and how does that play, right? So each of you will think basically how we're going to do today in the lecture. Um, it's really, your paper should be really practical rather than theoretical, because this is only Christian ethics kind of introductory course. And I really do not expect you to be the scholars in Christian ethics, which will be ridiculous. All I want is you to think through the materials that we covered and how does that apply to your own context, to your own life stories, to your own ethical struggles. And based on the feedback and interactions with the students, personal interactions between me and the students in meetings, I think it's really going well. because basically all of you are saying is that taking this course makes you think in your daily life that how does that work in terms of moral reasoning? What kind of theory am I applying to this situation as I go through the moral reasoning? Like basically you are doing the thing that I really wished that you would do. So you are really doing a great job, excellent job, all of you. So don't just be too anxious about it. Try to be practical, try to be just who you are and how you can utilize the resources that we have explored um, in order for you to be morally more sensitive and morally in-depth thinking. Okay, so let's get to the lecture. Part 2, week 10 already. We have total week 14 and we are in week 10. Oh my goodness. And this week we are going to discuss the intersectionality of domestic sexual violence and violence against the undocumented and immigrants. I know there are many issues in this week on the syllabus, and it's impossible to cover at each single subject in this week. This is more for you to grasp the basics of applied ethics, like various kinds of applied ethics. Again, this is introductory Christian ethics. Ethics in general is not an easy discipline to learn. So even if you struggle through this course, it doesn't mean that you need to be alert, because ethics, the discipline itself, because of its philosophical and ethical and theological base that the discipline is developed, it's not really like extremely easy discipline to understand in depth. But that's what's good about introductory courses for Christian ethics. So anyways, let's get to it. So we are going to focus on violence, specifically sexual violence, domestic violence, and the violence against immigrant, migrants, and asylum seekers. So first of all, the terms. The term sexual assault refers to sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent of the victim. And examples of the types of sexual violences are attempted rape, unwanted sexual touching, forcing a victim to perform sexual acts, and rape. And of course, like there are other types of sexual violence, but these are the examples of it. Domestic violence is a violence that takes place within a household between two different people or more. This can happen between a parent and child, between siblings, or even between roommates. Any family members can be included in this, or anyone who lives in the same household can be involved in domestic violence. Intimate partner violence, also called IPV, may or may not take place in the same household because intimate partners may or may not live together. IPV includes any abusive behaviors that one intimate partner, either current or former, holds power over another intimate partner physically, sexually, mentally, psychologically, financially, legally, socially, culturally, communally, in any kind of dimension. So IPV and domestic violence are almost always about the power and control. And IPV and domestic violence also has overlaps. There are many different types of domestic violence. But for example, sexual abuse in domestic violence, financial abuse, sexism, emotional abuse, using one's immigration status, any kind of like social like minority standing, spiritual abuse, physical abuse, use of children's insecurity. Like if you leave, for example, as the victim survivor, if you leave the household, um, the 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 perpetrator will threaten that like the child will be abused, or I'm gonna kill the kid or something like that. So there are many types of domestic violence and examples. Sexual violence and intimate partner violence are categorized as types of gender-based violence. So these are the basic terms in sexual violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and so on. Of course, intimate partner domestic violence is also another term that you can think of. You can refer to this page, PowerPoint slide. So each term explains each category of like some type of violence. Here, within these different categories of gender-based violence, people, especially in this field, activists or scholars, use terms very carefully, especially victim, survivor, victim/survivor. So let's just learn about the distinctions of these different terms. Some of you have taken my course for course of pastoral care 1, and we definitely have gone through this. So it's good always to be reminded of the definitions and distinctions, right? So just bear with me for this page. Victim tends to be used to keep the focus on the perpetrator who abused the other person. Therefore, the person who was abused became the victim. Therefore, the violence is not the victim's fault, right? So victim itself is representing that kind of implication. Victim is used for those who have recently been affected by sexual violence or abuse, and in the discussions of particular crime or in legal settings. While victim is a legal definition necessary within the criminal justice system, sometimes activists are concerned that the term victim may carry the connotations of passivity or like complete powerlessness of the victim. So survivor comes up. Survivor, the term, involves implications of the resilience, agency, the power of the person who survived such trauma, such sufferings. So either term can be used based on the situation. Victim does not necessarily mean that it's not ethically insensitive. It's more of different term. And depending on the situation, you can just use victim as a term, or you can use survivor, or you can use both. Scholars or activists in the field tend to use both terms, victim survivors, at the same time, in order to remember what happened was injustice, which means the person's victim, and that they survived, which means which represents that they hold power, they have agency. Then why is it important to define the terms and use each term properly? Because depending on the term that you use, we can name that was injustice, that was oppression, and that is not right. So it's basically counter narrative, providing the counter narrative to the narrative that's oppressive, that's like violent and violating human rights. According to Center for Disease Control in the United States, more than 1 in 3 women have experienced any form of sexual violence in their lifetime, and approximately 1 in 5 women have experienced attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. For men, nearly 1 in 4 people experienced any form of sexual violence, and 1 in 38 men experienced attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. An average of 24 people per minute are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in the United States. More than 12 million women and men over the course of a single year. Nearly 3 in 10 women, 29%, and 1 in 10 men, 10%, in the US have experienced rape, reported that they have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by a partner, and reported it having a related impact on their functioning. So if you have read the Lindemann's chapter for this week, you probably notice the numbers are pretty different and various. And even within this, the statistics that I am offering, there are some irregularity. Like it's not really consistent. Why? Because, as Lindemann mentions, despite the current high rates, I mean, look at this number. These numbers, they're extremely high. But despite the current extremely high rates of sexual violence, it is highly possible, again, that the actual percentages are much, much higher than these numbers, reported numbers, because of the reluctance of the victim survivors to come forth. And it's not their fault. Socially and culturally, everything, all the systems and structures make these victim survivors hard to come forth to report. So there are even like phone calls to 911, and after they ask the process, after someone getting raped, they ask like, what's the process, what they need to do, and oftentimes just they hang up, because it's almost impossible for them to prove that there was rape, there was some type of sexual violence, because it happens in the private sector oftentimes, and also the current legal system is not really in favor of victim survivors. Lindemann, in her very short chapter, summarized and pointed out the core problems that we have regarding the issues of violence. So please make sure that you read the whole chapter. It's really, really short. So it's highly underreported. Just that's our takeaway. Let's see. So perpetrators of sexual violence exploit intersectional social components that are convolutedly intertwined and that are playing against the sexual violence victim survivors. When one lives a life at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities and statuses, the marginalized components of their identity highly increase their vulnerability to being a target of sexual violence, meaning gender, race, socioeconomic status, their language, culture, all these different things come together at the intersection of one person's social identity, and those components are all included in the minority group, then this person is much more likely that the much more likely is to be targeted by these perpetrators, because perpetrators know that they're socially not as protected as other people who are in the dominant group in the society. We can find an example of this in an article by Julie Gorschild and Richard Catalogron, in which they share Aura's study. This is Elias, story of seeking asylum. Aura, who fled for her life from dangerous domestic violence in Guatemala, was seeking asylum with her nephew in the US. And unfortunately, unlike her hope and expectation in the US, she faced another form of violence in the US detention center, that is sexual harassment and rape. A border patrol agent came to her and swore at her, insulted her about her body, and forced her to have an alone time with him by threatening her that he will not release her nephew from custody if she does not follow him in a like enclosed space. When she was alone with him, by force, he raped her. And despite the short elaboration of the sexual violence Aura experienced, it does not require much effort. I mean, this is such short description of what happened to her, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not very hard for us to imagine what happened. It's a new story about a distant other stranger that we've never met before, but the nature of the story does not surprise us in our immoral society. That's the problem that we have. And these kind of cases are so prevalent, but so unheard. So looking into Aura's case, we find the intersectional components of race, gender, citizenship, immigration status, nationality, and economic and social classes that are working against her. Then is this individual violence or systemic and structural violence? The offender knows that Aura has little power to protect herself as a woman asylum seeker with a dependent, right? Her nephew. There's someone that she needs to protect, yet she doesn't have even power to protect herself socially. So with that being said, the offender, the detention center officer, will most likely face no consequence for the sexual crime he commits. Sexual violence is not merely a violence against a certain gender or sexuality. In Aura's story, injustice is exacerbated through the various forms of violence, including racism, sexism, and violence against asylum seekers. This is systemic evil carried out through legal institutions by state officials. When one's identity is formed at the intersection of multiple oppressed social components, such as a person of color from a low socioeconomic class with undocumented status, they become more vulnerable to the violence because the offenders target them easily. Also, the degree and the length of the exposure to the violence will likely be worse than those who are from a relatively socially privileged background. Example cases can be easily found. For example, among those women who flee from Central America, 80% of them experience sexual assault on their way to seeking asylum in the United States. Also, another study reports that young immigrant women experience sexual violence double the rate of their non-immigrant counterparts that are staying in their own country, meaning when young immigrant women try to seek asylum or immigrate to another country, in the process, the possibility of them going through sexual violence is double than those who stay in their own country. In international and domestic power dynamics surrounding that victim survivors directly affect their vulnerability at the intersection of geopolitics, economic and social status, race, gender, ethnicities, religion, nationality, language, and immigration citizenship status. These factors are so intricately interwoven that they create a unique impact on each victim survivor by being manifested in distinct manners. So when you see a case of victim survivor and the story, when you read the story, I really want you to try to read that story from this intersectional perspective approach. That will give you a lot of, that will show you a lot of things that you have never thought about before. So systemic evil, I'm using my book that's gonna most likely, hopefully, be published next year. So systemic evil denotes immorality or sinfulness that is caused, sanctioned, promoted, and perpetuated by marginalizing social, cultural, and economic attitudes and systems, as well as institutional practices. Systemic evil also included sanctioned indifference to systemic forms of harm, mostly targeting subjugated, vulnerable groups of people. Systemic evil perpetuates a power structure that maintains consistent categories of dominance and subordination. Even though there are differences between personal wrongdoing and systemic evil, personal action and the deliberation process is directly influenced by social cultural systems as human beings shape and are shaped by all these surroundings and the components, social components such as religion, culture, society, and community. And systemic evil creates different forms of violence, one of which is sexual violence. The severity of and the sustained practice of sexual violence in detention centers is a bold example of how scrupulously and orally systemic evil is carried out as a form of sexual violence. And these rates and statistics are something that we don't usually hear about too often, because they are the marginalized of the marginalized. According to community initiatives for visiting immigrants in confinement, it's called CIVIC, in a letter of civil rights complaint filed in 2017 to the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, it's called ICE, in the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, 33,126 complaints of sexual and or physical assault had been filed against agencies under DHS. However, according to the letter, only 0.07%, not even 0.10%, 0.07% out of the complaints were taken into open investigation. not even just not even the percentage that the perpetrators got proper um, penalties, right? Um, these cases, less than 0.10% cases, went to open investigation by the Office of Inspector General, which rarely results in charging the offenders for sexual crimes. So you see how bad it is. And this is part of our society. And someone, a actual human being, is going through this. This may seem and sound like it's just someone far away from me is going through this. But think about it, they're human beings, just same as we are. They are being loved by God. They are the ones, the children of God, like us. And they're going through this. I mean, today I had a really busy day. But when you think of the life that one of these people are going through, yesterday, can you imagine how many people were being targeted by these offenders in detention centers and going through horrible, horrible experiences that you would never want to even imagine in your life. So this is actually happening in our lives. And considering the fact that it is extremely difficult for the detainees to file a legal complaint against the officers in the detention centers, you see the power dynamics, how difficult it's for the detainees to file such complaints, legal complaints against the officers. So we can easily imagine how rare it is for the cases to be heard and justice rendered. So it's almost impossible that they claim just basic human rights in detention centers through the legal process and actually justice rendered. It's almost impossible. According to Civic, the top 5 immigration detention centers with the highest number of sexual assault complaints are privately operated facilities, meaning these are for-profit detention centers. Obama administration tried to reduce the numbers because of such injustice and such violences, and such horrible violences are happening, and it's just outside the legal system. So they try to reduce the numbers of for-profit detention centers. And, after the Obama administration was over and the Trump administration took over, because of all these different involvement of this big for-profit privately operated facility group, it's called GEO group, and other huge group which also operates the profitable detention center in the US. They because of their campaign fundraising and all these different political activities, they gained even bigger amount of contract in the US for the detention center, which is really unfortunate. So as you can see, it is a complete delusion that sexual violence is merely a matter of an individual violation against another individual. The complicatedly intermingled systems actually enable sexual offenders to commit such violence by taking advantages of marginalized people And unequivocally, this represents how sexual crimes are not limited to a person-to-person event, but are systematically sanctioned by economic, political, and legal institutional practices in this case. The dominant or marginalizing systems that constitute systemic evil directly impact the dynamics of how sexual violence happens and how it affects victim survivors, and why it's so hard for them, for the victim survivors, to come forth, to break their silence and to share what happened to them. It's not just like one level, it's really multi-layered and intricately intermingled social systems, social cultural norms, and how people think, how people behave based on the systems. And it's all so very complicated. And it's never, ever just individual violation against one another individual. And as you can see in Aura's case, like, what's causing that one sexual violence that's done to Aura, you see how complicated it is, like how complicatedly institutionally, systematically, legal systems comes in, and the power dynamics between this detention center officer and Aura, who doesn't have any social power, social institutional and justice power within US system. Okay. So another thing that we need to pay attention to when it comes to sexual violence, domestic violence, all these different gender-based violence is misogynistic beliefs and norms. From culture, society, and community that reinforce systemic evil. These norms and beliefs are not only one of the causations to the prevalence of sexual violence, but also they affect victim survivors of sexual violence in the aftermath of abuse. In a carefully argued book, I really like her book, Kate Mann, Down Girl, down here. It's a really interesting book to read, and you will learn a lot about misogyny and how it plays out in society. So anyways, in this book, she's a philosopher, moral philosopher. So she thoroughly illuminates the implications of misogyny in our society. And she starts her conversation with criticism of a largely believed too naive definition of misogyny, which is too narrow and not focused enough. She then suggests a very well articulated definition. For men, misogyny should be perceived as the system that operates within a patriarchal social order to police and enforce women's subordination. Excuse me. And to uphold male dominance, in which women will tend to face hostility of various kinds because they're women in a man's world that is a patriarchy, who are held to be failing to live up to patriarchal standard. Because of this, misogynist hostilities will often target women quite selectively rather than targeting women across the board. Let me echo with her definition. Misogyny is not merely about certain hostile emotions toward any and every woman. Rather, it is a system that is a part of larger systems, which police and enforce selected women who do not conform to the gendered and oppressive norms in order to perpetuate men's world. In this sense, within the system of misogyny, victim blaming and victim shaming cultures function alongside of and fuel attitudes about a lack of credibility for women. These cultures are prevalent, especially in cases of sexual violence. Um, so when victim survivors come forth and share what happened to them, it's so prevalent to see victim shaming and victim blaming culture and attitudes in their communities. There are many examples that of such thing that I just explained. I'm not gonna go into um, go and like explain all these examples. It's so easy to find. Unfortunately, it's so easy to find those examples of like victim survivors being re-victimized by victim shaming and victim blaming culture and norms. So you can see we are only looking into sexual violence today. And you see all these different social identity components come and play together against the victim survivors. It's not just one level individual person going through the violence. It's not one violence never ever is at individual level. It's all intermingled, always intersectionally intermingled. One's citizenship status, one's race, one's social class, one's gender identity, one's economic class, one's language, one's culture. Like, is the culture Eurocentered culture? Is the culture Asian culture? Is the culture Native American culture? That is the culture socially domineering culture that you're from? Depends on all these different social factors. The violence, the depth of it, how it's done, and why it's done. All these are coming together and play together. So in Aura's case, her citizenship status turned to be power, became the target. Well, her citizenship status played against her because of her lack of citizenship in the U.S. The power abuse of the detention center office happened, right? And then racism. There's definitely racism involved. No social support system that Aura had, so it was she became the easy target. And sexism, misogynistic norms that like insulting about her body, and it's just all like coming together to make it easy for the offender to rape her in detention center. And he didn't have to face any, as far as I know, he didn't have to face any charging legal legal penalty against legal penalty for what he did against her. So it's frustrating to see how marginalized people are even more marginalized because of the intersectionality of their oppressed social identity components. Then how do we understand this case when you hear this story and also the case that we will read in our readings this week? How does that affect your Christian stance, and also how does your Christian stance affect you as you go through the moral reasoning of why it's wrong, what's wrong, and certain like moral deliberation process. So let's go back to Lavin's four versions of Christian stance. If you are holding, by the way, I really enjoy reading your discussion forum post when you talk about your Christian stance, and some people are, oh, I mean, definitely in synergy. Some people are like, I'm definitely in liberation. Some people are like, I think I'm more towards integrity. Some people are like, I think I'm between liberation and synergy. All this different spectrum of stance that one person's stance never is the same as other person's stance. It's all so different, and everyone's stance makes sense. um, so anyways, looking at four versions of Christian stance and your own Christian stance, what do you think when you um, think about these cases of what's happening in detention centers, and what happened to Aura, what happened to the person that you're going to read in, let's see, let me go back all the way down here. Makado's chapter, the unnamed woman. You will read the one case there. And when you read or hear these stories, what does your moral reasoning process look like? Like, do you think it's bad? Do you think it's injustice? Um, if so, why? On what ground are you thinking? Are you coming to that conclusion? And how does your Christian stance play in the process? So these are all very interconnected subjects. And I really want you to think not just about the case separately and then think about like theoretical ground of Christian stance separately. It's all together, right? You just heard about a story that you've never heard before, most likely. And as you listened to that, what was the emotions that you had? You had found in you, or what was the thoughts that just popped up in your head, in your mind, and why do you think it was that, and how does that relate to your Christian stance? Because when you just think about this as is, the Christian stance as is, it's less critical. When you read it, when you think about your Christian stance, we tend to be less critical. When we actually think about a case, a story of someone being violated, and when you think about your Christian stance through this lens and vice versa, it's much more critical. It makes us to think more critically. So when you hear the story, what was your first thought? And is there any thought process that's challenged by connecting this Christian stance, Lavin's four versions of Christian stance? And how would you interpret that case ethically and morally by using your Christian stance? What would Stanley Hauerwas say about this case? What would Jesus Christ say about this case and about this violence? Just leave all these political divisions and different thoughts and ideas and ideologies, just leave all behind and think about Jesus Christ. What would Jesus Christ do when Jesus saw this woman suffering in detention center, going through all these different sufferings? That's definitely unjust. So it's a dehumanization of one person and personality. So that's the connecting point with this week's lecture and and what you have learned and what you have developed in terms of your Christian stance. And this is basically what you will do in your final paper. And I wanted to really bring back Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail that I cited in week 2 and 3. How can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of, two types of laws, just and unjust. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. In that sense, Aura's case, Aura's human personality, the human rights, human dignity, is degraded by the offender and by the system. So definitely that's the injustice that's done to her. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. So this reading is optional reading for this week. And it's an optional, but I really want you to read this letter if you haven't done so. So all these different lands that we have covered in this semester for this course gives you some angles, right? Some perspectives as you look into certain cases and as you try to find out what's moral, what's immoral, and what's justice, what's injustice, what's the proper way for us to take action about what should we do to to be the peace building maker, peace building agent. In the LEAP course, I have discussed this trauma exposure rate. For those of you who haven't taken the course, let's look at some numbers here. Rates of trauma exposure among some samples of members of certain cultural, ethnic, and socioeconomic and racial groups are higher than the US average, as you can easily imagine. Women are more exposed to traumas caused by domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual violence. Studies have shown that LGBTQ individuals have greater exposure to trauma and higher PTSD rates compared to people who are heterosexual. According to National Sexual Violence Resource Center, it's called NSVRC, 81% women and 43% men experience some form of sexual harassment. However, LGBTQ people experienced around 60%. Both lesbian women and gay men experience some form of contact sexual violence as compared to 53% heterosexual women and 29% hetero men experience some form of contact sexual violence. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, data collected from approximately 34,000 people shows that people in urban areas and those with lower socioeconomic status are at greater risk for certain types of trauma. Trauma always involves violence. Even it doesn't have to be physical violence, but trauma tends to involve violence a lot. And for example, in a study suggests that over among 1,300 African American residents of Detroit, whose annual incomes are below $35,000, 87.2% had gone through at least one type of trauma during their lives. Each social identity component of minority has significantly high exposure to traumatic events, which involves violence, compared to the dominant group of society in that category. So let's think of someone who's woman, whose gender is minority group in a minority group, right? Women, or a person from of LGBTQ, who is a person of color and whose socioeconomic status is low and who seeks asylum, fleeing from their own country's violence. Can you imagine how all these different social identity components work against a person and how severely different life they will have compared to other people whose social component, identity components are mixture of dominant and non-dominant groups. So based on their race, gender, ethnicity, they're just based on who they are, basically. The violence happens to be extremely higher than other people who come from the dominant group in society. So intersectionality in this sense is such an important lens through which we can look into social injustice and how we can take peace building action. So these are the things that we need to, I want us to think about this week. Again, when you read the cases or stories, or even the case of your own that you picked for your final paper, if you have done so, when you read it or when you reflect on it, what does your moral reasoning process look like? And how does your Christian stance play in the process? And is there any challenges that you faced compared to the time before you took this class and after you took this course, after you learned about Christian vision and Christian stance and the theologies and peace building, discipleship, all these things, how does that come all together to your moral reasoning process? And how does that change your moral reasoning and the conclusion? Even if the conclusion doesn't change, was there any changes in your moral reasoning process, moral deliberation process? Also, what does it mean to us as peace building agents? Like, does this subject that we discussed today give you any kind of insight or thoughts that you never had before uh, as peace building agents in this world, as the Jesus disciples in this world? How do we challenge this social injustice? And in what ways can we do as a community um, to help and support these victim survivors? What are the action we can take to seek peace for the marginalized? What are those actions that you can possibly take in your daily life? What do you see that you did not see before? Is there anything that you didn't hear before? Have you heard of this sexual violence, domestic violence, or all these stories? And also, have you thought about the violence that's done in detention centers? If not, then what was your feelings? What was your thoughts as you listened to those stories? Is there any story that you can think of that it may seem like individual struggle, but in depth, the struggle is caused by systemic evil? So now you have this different perspectives lens that you can utilize as you look into a case. is there any story that you'd never thought before that it's the systemic evil involved? It's caused by the systemic evil, not just one individual level. Also, how does it look if you apply the lens of intersectionality to the case that you chose for your final paper? So these are just something that you can kind of sit on and reflect on. And hopefully as you are trying to prepare your proposal and you've submitted the midterm papers and great job on those. I really hope that this learning process doesn't really cause too much anxiety, too much overwhelming anxiety for you. And also, again and again, I emphasize, if you need to talk to us, just reach out to us, me or Joe, and ask some questions. You can talk it out, whatever that's stuck in your mind and that makes you anxious or that makes you um, not being able to easily develop your ideas or proposals, whatever it is. Reach out to me and we will figure it out. All right. Hopefully you have a peaceful week, and next week I don't think I'll give any lecture unless I change my mind, which is always possible. But this was a lengthy lecture this week again, so um, I I think I'm gonna share some video material that you can just sit back and relax and watch next week. All right, so see you whenever that is. Like, see you in the next lecture. Okay, have a good week and let me know if you have any questions or concerns. All right, have a God bless. And I need to stop recording and I can't find the button. Here we go. All right, God bless. Bye bye.